Hello, welcome back to Psych 3400 Social Psychology. We are on our third week of lectures, and today we will be talking about social cognition. Let's begin, as we usually do, with a broad, thoughtful question as to what is social cognition. The concept of social cognition came up in our first lecture and in your first chapter's reading. I didn't cover this in the lecture, but in the first chapter of the textbook, they cover a brief history of the study of social behavior and the different perspectives that have influenced our understanding of social behavior throughout the years. One of these perspectives is the social cognitive perspective. And the social cognitive perspective is really so important to social psychology that it's also one of our main four core assumptions of social psychology. Do you guys see how I'm calling back to past lectures to highlight what's important for you to know? Social cognition is a foundational piece of social psychology, and the assumption that behavior is strongly influenced by our social cognition is integral to almost every social psychology research project that you will come into contact with. So for our purposes, we can broadly define social cognition as an investigation and an understanding of how humans organize and navigate the social world, including people in it, including themselves. When we're taking a social cognitive approach to human behavior, one of the things we want to understand is what are the meaningful processes through which we construct a meaningful understanding of the world. Take a step back and really consider everything that's out there in the world. Take a look in the room you're in, which you've probably sat in way too much since the pandemic began. And take in all of the objects in your room. Think of the people that you might share a house with, or those that you see at the grocery store. There's really an overwhelming amount of stimuli in the environment, and if we were always attending to it, we wouldn't be able to function. There would just be too much to consider, too much to attend to, too much to assess to make sure that we're safe. So there's something we have to do with all of the stimuli. We have to organize it and make sense of it so that way we can navigate the world in a meaningful way. To do this requires us making some assumptions about that stimuli out in the world, about us taking in this information and organizing it so that way we don't have to worry about it all the time. But this, of course, then can lead to missteps occasionally, or just differences in behavior. And so this is what we'll spend a lot of the lecture talking about today, is how we take in this information, organize it, and then how that subsequently affects our behavior. Okay, so first I have a nice example for you guys from Key and Peele. I don't know if any of you guys have watched it. When it first came out, I thought it was a Chappelle Show ripoff, and so I was really snooty about it, but it's actually pretty good. So I should disclose that this clip does have a lot of profanity in it, and so if you're not comfortable with that, that's completely fine, obviously. And you can just skip to the next slide right after this, where I'll talk about some of the things that happened in this video and why it's relevant to our lecture today. But hopefully you guys are okay with watching it. And if you are, go ahead and go into the PowerPoint and find the video, and you can watch it within the PowerPoint, or it can take you to a YouTube link, I think, either way. And then once you've watched it, go ahead and go to the next slide. Alright, so hopefully most of you were able to watch them. So for a recap, for anyone who didn't, it's these two comedians in a skit, and they're texting back and forth, and they very clearly have different interpretations of what the other one is saying, even though they are receiving right objective information from one another. There is a subjective interpretation of what's going on. So the guy that you can see in the screenshot, his name is Key. He's texting his friend Peel about meeting up, and Peel is sort of coming across like he doesn't care, and then Key responds with anger. Peel doesn't notice that he's angry and just thinks he's super nice, and it escalates from there, and in a pretty funny way. And so this is a perfect example of how our social cognition influences our behavior. For whatever reason, angry guy Key in this skit uh, has some ideas and assumptions about how someone should make plans and what it implies when they say something in a certain way, right? So when Jordan Peele's character keeps saying whatever, right, he means it in a nice way, like whatever you want, I'm down. But he interprets it in a way that's dismissive and rude. So we know that this happens a lot in text, but it also happens in our everyday situations where someone behaves or acts a certain way or they say something, and based off the assumptions and experiences we have, we make interpretations about their behavior that may or may not be true. This lecture is going to be very focused on understanding why that is and how that is. So it occurred to me while I was building this lecture that something that might feel really relevant to you guys, that is along these lines, are the assumptions, motivations, and expectations we have for dating, especially if you use dating apps. I think dating apps have, in a lot of ways, changed our cultural assumptions towards dating. Um, I think there used to be potentially an assumption of monogamy, right? That if you went on a date with someone, that's the only person you're dating. And as dating apps like Tinder and Bumble become the norm, it seems like there's more of a shift towards this assumption that you're not monogamous until you have a conversation about it. But there are things beyond that that I think are quite interesting about people's assumptions for Tinder and other dating apps. When I was in college, I had this group of guy friends, and I was really surprised to find that they felt very frustrated when they were on Tinder because they sort of conceptualized Tinder as a hookup app, and that therefore every girl on there was immediately down the hookup. And we obviously know that's not the case. And to them, this is what the app was for, and therefore anyone not using it is being rude or disingenuous. Really, though, what we find is that people are motivated to use Tinder for a lot of different reasons. So this one study found that sex and love is a big reason for Tinder. Tinder is used for casual hookup type relationships, but long-term relationships also come out of it quite a bit as well. Tinder is also used for self-esteem enhancement. So I think we maybe talked a bit about self-esteem enhancement in the first lecture, where I also talked about self-verification theory. So it's a pretty straightforward concept. We like to feel good about ourselves and we seek that out. I don't think it's a surprise to anyone that people often use Tinder for self-enhancement. What was interesting is that this research project found that people who use Tinder primarily for self-esteem enhancement also tend to endorse more problematic Tinder use. So when I say problematic Tinder use, what I'm talking about is sort of addictive behaviors towards Tinder. They found that problematic use is something that dominates your thinking, affects your mood, causes negative emotions when you aren't using it, and conflicts with your relationship. And so you or someone you might know might have some problematic Tinder use behaviors if you find yourself thinking about it a lot, getting a lot of positive feedback from it, etc. One of my friends browses Tinder every morning when he's waking up, which I find to be very interesting. Along those lines, one of the other main motivations for Tinder is boredom. And so, a fun story I have about this is that I met my current boyfriend on Tinder, and he casually mentioned to me that he had deleted Tinder and then re downloaded it out of boredom, and that's how he came across my profile. So, we're basically a modern day Romeo and Juliet. What's interesting to think about here, though, is what came up on the slide before with the Key and Peele skit. We often go into social situations assuming something, and oftentimes assuming that the other person assumes the same thing as us. But that's really not the case. So if you're on Tinder or a different dating app, it's very possible that the person that you match with might not be using it for the same reasons you are. And their motivations for using it might suggest then that they will behave differently in their use of it and could lead to some incompatibility or just maybe some social fissures. One of the other interesting things about Tinder is that it plays into judgment of other people. And so this one research project found that Tinder users were judged as less trustworthy, just in general. So when people are presented with the same pictures of a given person and told that this is a Tinder profile versus a Facebook profile, they're just judged as less trustworthy. This is especially true for men versus women who are using Tinder. This could be due to women being judged as warmer, nicer, less threatening. You can see how personality factors and demographics then also play into these judgments of social behavior. So just on this slide, we have covered a lot of important things to understanding social cognition, including cultural assumptions, personal beliefs and experiences. This is going to come up a lot as we go through this lecture. So now that we have some working examples that hopefully make sense to us and make this material a little more engaging, let's take a step back for just a moment and discuss the historical context of social cognition and really what it's derived from. Social cognition is derived from Gestalt psychology, which is the school of psychology emphasizing that humans perceive the environment in patterns and configuration rather than individual components. So the famous line associated with Gestalt psychology is that the whole is more than the sum of its parts. This is significant because I was just saying to you guys that the world is full of such an incredible amount of overwhelming stimuli that we have to make sense of it somehow. We have to build some kind of workable pattern out of the stimuli being thrown at our faces to make sense of the world and to navigate it with a sense of safety. This is consistent with Gestalt psychology. Take a moment and look around your room, whatever room you're in, and just scan it for maybe a couple seconds. The fact that you can look at an external space that is presumably full of items in just a couple seconds demonstrates how you are processing the environment in a configural fashion rather than a way that looks at the individual components. If you were to stop and look at the individual components of everything in the room you're sitting in, it would take minutes or even hours to really identify and consider everything there. Configural processing, so that is taking in something as the whole rather than the sum of its parts, allows us to process environments quickly and to habituate, right, or become comfortable with environments. So that way we can do other things rather than just sit down and look at all of the stuff in front of us. Consistent with this, people construct their own understanding of reality. So there's so much stimuli out there that we need to make sense of it, and we can't make sense of all of it. So typically, we take the ambiguity of reality, right, and start selecting pieces of information that make sense, eventually organizing them into a knowledge network that we can use to navigate the world. What this means is that every human feasibly has a slightly different understanding of the world because they have had to create their own unique knowledge network. As we'll talk about throughout this lecture, this knowledge network is influenced by a number of social things, including our cultures, but nonetheless, each individual human is organizing their own knowledge network. I really think it's interesting to think about the way we take in information and how we habituate to our environments. You can think about this in more mundane ways, and then it'll hopefully become more interesting for you as you go through the lecture and learn about how it relates to social psychology. So another example I can think of is driving. So when you first move to a new city, or maybe you're visiting somewhere, driving tends to be a little overwhelming, right? I don't know about anyone else, but I tend to find myself a bit on edge um, as I'm listening to my phone tell me where to turn and where to go, as I'm trying to get a sense of what the driving culture is like, as I'm looking out for any street signs or infrastructures that I might not be familiar with. For example, I don't think there are a lot of roundabouts in Colorado Springs. So if you've ever been to a city that really relies on roundabouts, it's quite overwhelming to navigate at first. And you really have to put a lot more thought into it than you would if you were driving in a city you know very well. So once you move to a new city, it's overwhelming to drive at first, and then you find yourself becoming more and more comfortable until you get to the point where you can drive around the city without really thinking about it at all. Later on in the lecture, we'll talk a bit more about that, how there are these processes that involve a lot of conscious control that eventually become more automatic. So this is a general human tendency to take in information and organize it in a way so we don't have to worry so much about it. So next, let's start discussing the why of social cognition. What are the motivating factors that guide us in taking in this information and organizing it? First, let's talk about the theory of lay epistemology. So this theory was introduced to understand how people form knowledge and then modify their knowledge of the world. According to Kruglanski, that's me guessing how to pronounce his name, there are three broad epistemic motivations. And then for anyone who doesn't know what epistemic means, it just sort of means meaning or knowledge gathering. So our first epistemic motivation is the need to be accurate. Our second is the need for closure. And the third is the need to confirm. And we're going to cover all three of these in the next few slides. And then as you go throughout the lecture, try to keep these in your mind. And you can also consider how they play out in your everyday life. Because we have these three broad epistemic motivations, but as everything in social psychology, the extent to which they play out for each person depends on a number of factors. So some people are just going to have a personality tendency towards one of these epistemic motivations, but they also tend to depend on the context. The first epistemic motive, as I already mentioned, is the need for accuracy. So this just really refers to the need for objective information. For people sort of feeling that motive for the need for accuracy, there's a desire to see the whole picture, to whatever extent you can, know everything that's going on. When this is measured as a personality variable, it's often called need for accuracy, but also need for cognition. The need for accuracy often emerges when being inaccurate can result in undesired outcomes. So you can think about choosing a new car, right? There are a lot of people who put a good amount of research into what kind of car they'd like to buy because it's a lot of money. And also, side note, a lot of people die in car accidents. So you should buy something that's going to keep you safe. The downside, though, of this need for accuracy is that it's a long process that requires a lot of time, thought, and energy. And so when you don't have time or cognitive capacity or energy, need for accuracy might not be a feasible motivation. The need for accuracy really does stand in contrast to the other needs, because if you are really deeply committed to understanding a situation objectively, then it's going to be very hard to, for example, achieve closure. Because at what point, when you're seeking objective knowledge, can you really have closure when, as I've already mentioned 8 million times in this lecture, there's so much information out there, it's hard to really know if you'll ever be truly accurate. So our next epistemic motive is the need to reach closure. So as I mentioned on the prior slide, the need for accuracy really requires a lot of time. If you really don't have enough time or even resources to make a decision, you may be more motivated just to reach some sense of closure. So for example, this one study found that when people are given a limited amount of time to make an impression of someone, they tend to rely on the first bits of information they receive. So obviously it's not very accurate to just go off the first few things you learn, but it helps you reach closure very quickly. This tendency to remember or overemphasize information you received earlier rather than later is known as a primacy effect. This is also studied in neuropsychology and cognitive psychology for people who are just generally interested in how information gets encoded into one's memory. One of the other reasons why we might be motivated to reach closure is that we tend to be uncomfortable with inconsistency, or what you might describe as non-closure. Not knowing is one of the most annoying things for people. Usually we'd prefer to hear negative information than to not know for sure if someone is feeling negatively about us, for example. Similar to this, the meaning maintenance model argues that people are motivated to maintain a consistent sense of meaning and understanding in the world, and that when they are confronted with things that don't make sense, with things that are inconsistent or sort of odd, they are uncomfortable and will seek to close that discrepancy. So this is talked about quite a bit in your book, but the meaning maintenance model research has relied on priming people with word pairs that just are insane and don't make sense, like frog potato chip or something like that. And the idea there is that people who are exposed to these really wonky things will start to feel that discomfort, right, with being presented inconsistencies or things that aren't meaningful. A fun fact about this research too is that they have used short films by David Lynch. I don't know if anyone's a David Lynch fan, but he did some short films that I think were called Rabbits or something like that. And they found that it increases feelings of discomfort and meaninglessness in participants. So that's a fun fact for you. One of the other interesting things to note about this motive for closure is that there is a differentiation between specific versus non-specific closure. So non-specific closure is just this desire to have closure, and you don't care what it is. You just really want to move on from something. A specific closure means that you really just want a certain decision made or a certain result, and if you don't get that, you won't feel a sense of closure. So for this, I think of romantic relationships, and when a breakup is happening, that there are probably some people who sort of sense that their partner is unhappy, and they really just want the non-specific closure of knowing what's going to happen. Are we going to keep dating or not? We need to know. Whereas others might want very specific closure. They might go into a conversation with their partner wanting the partner to just say, no, there's not a problem. And of course, they might react negatively if that's not the case. Our next epistemic motive is the need for confirmation. So we talked about confirmation bias in our last lecture. This is the tendency to seek out or prefer information that confirms our already existing beliefs about the world. We are presumably motivated towards confirmation bias. So we can feel like we have a good understanding of the world. It might be that we rely on confirmation bias at times because we want to maintain our worldviews. That's another callback to the last lecture. As we talked about when confirmation bias first came up, we know that evaluations of evidence for or against capital punishment are influenced by pre-existing beliefs about capital punishment, and that this presumably is pretty true for most information. Another thing to note here is that ambiguous information can lead us to confirmation bias. So what we find is that individuals with chronic pain tend to interpret ambiguous words and images with more pain-related and illness-related words. So when we're presented with something that we can't immediately categorize into something we understand, we're more likely to fall back on things that make sense for us and to see that out in the world. Need for confirmation also likely drives biased information gathering. So one study that I forgot to cite here, sorry about that, found that being told a speaking partner was extroverted or introverted led to different questions being asked to prove whether that partner was in fact extroverted or introverted. So what I mean here is that they took a bunch of participants, told them they would be talking with someone, said they're extroverted and you should confirm that. And so, of course, participants had this hypothesis and they only went forward trying to confirm that hypothesis. But what you should know is that you can also confirm a hypothesis by disconfirming other hypotheses. Not literally, but it helps you provide further evidence for that. Biased information gathering is really relevant for anyone who is interested in clinical psychology or doing some sort of assessment. So even if you go into social work or criminal justice, anywhere where assessments happen, we develop these assessments that are supposed to be neutral and objective. And to be fair, these psychological assessments tend to be more reliable than just sending a bunch of interviewers out to talk to people. But nonetheless, when people already have a pre-existing idea about someone, they tend to look for information to confirm that. An example, and it's another clinical example, I hope that's okay, is that I study post-traumatic stress disorder. And so when I get a client at the Veterans Health and Trauma Clinic, in my interview, I'm going to really have a bias towards assessing and diagnosing PTSD. And I might not ask about other disorders as much because I study trauma and they've shown up to a trauma clinic and that suggests it's about trauma. But nonetheless, that's very biased of me. Confirmation bias also extends to ourselves and our understanding of ourselves. So this is related to the concept of a self-fulfilling prophecy, which is the phenomenon whereby initially false expectations cause the fulfillment of those expectations. So your book talks about an interesting study where teachers were informed about the aptitude of certain students, and it was randomly assigned. And then students who were proposed to have really great aptitude ended up doing better later on. This is consistent in a lot of different areas. So that study that your textbook talks about really talks about the impact of teachers on their students and how that improved aptitude. However, there was another study that found that children who have more difficult relationships with their parents are more likely to expect being rejected by social peers in adolescence. So this research project looked at children whose parents had alcohol problems and were creating sort of unstable, problematic home situations, and found that when that was happening in childhood, they were more likely in adolescence to experience these interpersonal issues. Again, sort of demonstrating this self-fulfilling prophecy that is really common among people. Also, it's important to note here that this is consistent with self-verification theory, which we talked about in the first lecture. So self-verification theory basically states that people seek out and prefer information consistent with their expectations and self-views, and that this is the case even when it's negative information. So according to self-verification theory, people will prefer information that is negative if it's consistent with their self-views more than positive information that is inconsistent with their self-views. So we can expect that these children who are demonstrating this self-fulfilling prophecy, right, of being sensitive to rejection by their peers, probably would prefer to hear more negative information about themselves than positive because it would be consistent with their self-views. Note, though, that one major difference between self-fulfilling prophecy and self-verification theory is that self-fulfilling prophecy emphasizes this idea of false expectations, right? Which is an interesting thing to say. It's kind of hard to prove whether or not an expectation is false. But I think what it's getting at here is that there's no evidence to suggest that they should fail, but because they expect it, it happens. Whereas in self-verification theory, they're really being consistent with a self-concept. Also note I'm talking about negative things here, but self-fulfilling prophecy and self-verification theory can extend to positive things too, right? We don't call it a self-fulfilling prophecy, but it's true that when you think positively about yourself and you hope for positive expectations, they're more likely to happen. Similarly, if you have a positive self-concept, you're obviously going to like hearing positive things about yourself more than negative things. But self-verification theory would also say you prefer positive, consistent feedback than positive, inconsistent feedback. So if someone told me I was a hard worker, I would respond positively to that. If someone told me that I look like a model when I'm 5'5", I would not respond positively to that because it's not consistent with my self-view. Along with our epistemic motivations, we also have affective motivations for social cognition. Recall in our last lecture where we spent a lot of time talking about motivations and social behavior. One of the things we talked about is that humans are inherently motivated towards security and growth, and that we're a bit hedonistic, right? We want to avoid bad feelings and approach good feelings. As we kind of covered in that lecture, our emotions presumably evolved to keep us safe, right? So our negative emotions distance us from things that might harm us, and our positive emotions keep us oriented towards things that will make us safe, happy, and more likely to reproduce. You can take a moment and think about a lot of the things you're motivated to do and how there tends to be an affective quality to them. When you blow off a friend and they seem mad at you, you probably feel quite ashamed. And one of the reasons why you're motivated to apologize to them is because you want to reduce that negative feeling. You might also be motivated to apologize because you feel a lot of care and love for them and you want to increase that feeling. And you don't get to love your friends if you're being rude to them, so you apologize to maintain that social connection. One of the important things to note here is this idea as mood as information. So we often look to our affective processes to understand what's going on in a situation and to judge it. So if you're feeling good, you might be more likely to interpret ambiguous stimuli as positive. If you're feeling good, you might be more motivated to downplay the negative consequences of something. So, for example, we have this study, and it was found that in a sample of women, when they were induced with positive mood versus negative mood, they reported lower levels of discrimination towards themselves and other women. So when women were feeling generally more positive, they said that, sexism doesn't happen that often. What's interesting is this only happened when an external attribution for the positive mood was not provided. So for example, in a study like this, participants were just told that they had been given research materials to make them feel more positive. And so then what the study found was that among those induced with positive mood, those who were told that they were being induced with a positive mood didn't actually report lower levels of discrimination towards themselves and other women because they now had a reason for their positive feelings. And presumably those didn't feed into their judgments of discrimination and sexism. It was only when women were feeling positive and they didn't know why that they then fed that into their interpretations of discrimination and sexism. So we're about to take a break, but I wanted to briefly review what we've talked about so far. Um, the setup of this lecture is a little interesting. We've taken a very broad approach to what we're talking about, and now we're about to get into some specifics and then move into more broad topics again. And so before we get into the specifics, I just really want to touch on what's important to take away from this first part of the lecture. At this point, I've said it so much, but take away that the world is full of overwhelming, often contradicting stimuli that must be organized in a coherent fashion. We need it to make sense to us, and through this process of organizing things into coherence, some things get lost in the process, and that's important for understanding social cognition. Also realize that we have basic motivations for how we organize this information. And we covered that with the lay epistemics and then the affective motivations. As we move through the next part of the lecture, keep these in mind. Okay, and now it's the break time, so this is a good place to stop for anyone who likes to break up their lectures. Okay, welcome back to anyone who left. And yeah, so now we have talked about some basic motivations for social cognition. We have some interesting examples to reflect on. Now we're going to talk about some of the components that go into the construction of our social cognition. The first concept you need to know about is a schema. So a schema is a mental structure that contains prior knowledge and associations with a concept. Categorization feeds into schemas and vice versa. So I know earlier I used the word categorization, but I can't remember for what now. But imagine going to a friend's house and you see a thing on the ground crawling on all fours, right? So as soon as you see that stimuli, you start looking for other information to categorize it because it could be a dog or a baby or a cat or a rat. And once you categorize what it is, you are going to activate a schema for how to react to it, right? So a dog or a cat you'd pet. You could also pet a baby, but maybe you would just pick it up and say hi. And a rat you would probably flee from. So our schemas act to help us understand what's out there in the world, and to give us directions for how to react and manage it. It's important to note that cultural knowledge contextualizes and guides our schema developments. So what I mean by this is that our cultural upbringing, the media representation, the popular stories and mythos, and our socialization all lead into the schemas we have for navigating the social world. So you can potentially think of examples for all of these and how they've fed into your understanding. For example, you maybe have not been to many funerals, or perhaps you have, but if you're young, you probably haven't been to very many. But you know, based off of media representations, story from your friends, family, and peers, etc., what is supposed to go on at a funeral, right? That you wear black, that you're quiet and probably shouldn't laugh. All of these things represent your schema for a funeral, and they might be impacted by your direct knowledge of what it's like to go to a funeral, but just as likely they're informed by other things in our culture. Another thing I want to note here is how our schema development and our understanding of schemas is really benefited well by humans' capacity for symbolic thought. So the capacity for symbolic thought was discussed in our last lecture, and it really means that humans are able to move beyond basic associations of stimuli in the environment and attach symbolic meaning to things, right? And so again, to use an example from the last lecture, your schema of a big metal box that has red and green lights on it is informed by the symbolic knowledge that red means stop and green means go. So next, let's talk about different kinds of schemas. First, we have scripts. These are schemas about an event that specify the typical sequence of actions that take place. So take a moment and think about how we develop our scripts. Spoiler alert, it's what I just talked about, which is the cultural aspect of our schema development. But something to think about here is social cognitive theory, which I've touched on a few times now, and how the processes described in social cognitive theory ultimately inform our schemas about the world, including our scripts. So in our lecture where I brought this up, I talked about how when I go to coffee shops, I often look around to see what people are doing, so I know what to do. I, as a person, have a general script for what I'm supposed to do in a coffee shop, right? But I also am aware that it changes a little bit from each coffee shop to coffee shop you go, and because of that, I'm constantly informing and updating my script. So I generally know what a coffee shop is going to be like, and then I specifically know what it's going to be like if I go to Third Space Coffee or Kairos Coffee, because I've been there several times before. We also have impressions. These are schemas that people have about other individuals. So first, there are stereotypes or group schemas. So these are schemas for groups of people. Over time, through media, socialization, and stories, we develop broad ideas about what a category of people are like. What I found interesting is that here in the US, we're pretty okay at not being too stereotypical. I know that might sound insane to some of you, but I lived in Europe for a year, and what I found was that they were much more comfortable um, saying that certain groups of people were a certain way. There, it tended to be about other countries, and so we would maybe make jokes about how German academic writing is really dense, for example, and I apologize to anybody who's offended by that. Um, but those are the types of jokes that would be made by Dutch people. But here, if we were to say that, women write really dense academic literature, there wouldn't be responded to so positively. People often argue that stereotypes come from truthful information. I can't dispute that. There's always going to be evidence to support a stereotype. But, as I've said, there is such an overwhelming amount of information out in the world that just having some evidence to support a claim, including a stereotype, isn't really convincing, right? Our schema development often comes from biased sources of information, such as rumors and gossip, stories from other people, cultural representations. It's covered pretty deeply in your book, talking about how stories about other people change a little bit over time. People conveniently leave out information, or they only tell the most scandalous parts of a story, and you can then see how that can contribute to negative or untrue stereotypes about certain groups of people. There are probably plenty of German academics that write in very clear, understandable language, but if some Dutch academics want to throw some shade and start saying that Germans have really dense writing, it can suddenly get picked up, and suddenly there's a stereotype about German academic writers. Just as an example. So I think the cultural influence on schema development is incredibly important, and I want to apply it to this theory called objectification theory. Objectification theory is a really interesting theory that came out in the 1990s, and it basically stated that Western culture overemphasizes the importance of physical appearance and sexual worth in women, leading to the internalization of objectification standards. So what this means is that, from the perspective of this theory, women are taught from a cultural perspective that women should strive to be attractive and sexually appealing, and that that's the most important thing. And then this theory also states that this gets internalized into women's own schema development and schema concept of themselves. And this is reflected by self-objectification, the tendency to view oneself from an outside perspective and to emphasize the importance of one's physical and sexual appeal over other traits. Self-objectification is measured in a lot of different ways. Recall from our first lecture where we talked about how abstract concepts are operationalized into different measurements that are reported to reflect them. So one of the ways that self-objectification is operationalized is through asking someone to list what their most important characteristics are. If someone puts, their physical attractiveness, their face, their sex appeal, their sex ability, that suggests self-objectification, at least compared to someone who says, my intelligence, my warmth, my love for others. Another way that self-objectification is measured is through self-report questionnaires asking people how often they are focused on their own physical appearance and worrying about how they are perceived by others, right? And so that speaks to the outside perspective part there of self-objectification. So inherent in objectification theory is this developmental piece, right? That Western culture is just inundating all women with this idea that they're really only worth their physical attractiveness. Well, if that's the case, then what we should see is that experiences of objectification or being taught that women are only important for their physical appearance should then lead to self-objectification. And we have some research that really supports that idea. So one study found that adolescents who experienced peer sexual harassment later reported higher levels of self-objectification and body shame. So they found themselves more focused on their physical appearance and feeling worse about their physical appearance. Another study in adolescents found that adolescent children, both boys and girls for the record, who internalized media ideal images of physical fitness, right? So they want to look like Kendall Jenner and I don't know what a male equivalent of Kendall Jenner is, but the male equivalent of Kendall Jenner, people who really want to look like that later reported self-objectification, body image concerns, and disordered eating. So we can see here then how these cultural influences lead to this development of what is important for the self and in turn affects behavior, including really problematic behaviors such as disordered eating. Thankfully, schemas can change. So schemas are essentially made up of patterns of learned associations. And so that means any given schema you have can be relearned. So if you feel a little racist or like maybe you have some low self-esteem, realize that that can be fixed, typically through therapy. So if schemas come from cultural and interpersonal sources of knowledge, changing these sources can change the schema. And so if any of you guys were worried about how an objectifying society might be leading to harmful feelings and behaviors among women and men, you might be happy to learn that when adolescent and young women were exposed to images of performance athletes versus sexualized pictures of athletes, they reported lower levels of self-objectification. So people who have schemas that have been really impacted by objectification can then benefit from exposing themselves to things that are more body positive and things that emphasize something other than the importance of the physical body's attractiveness, such as the physical body's strength, or just trying to move beyond your physical body in general and appreciate your mind. Along those lines, here we have a video of Richard Petty, who has a great last name, talking briefly about social cognition. And he touches on how we can change people's minds. So it's consistent with our last slide. So go and watch this. It's required. There will probably be a question about it. Richard Petty is a big deal in social psychology. Very nice, interesting guy. It shouldn't come as a surprise at all that our schemas influence quite a bit. You know, they're the building blocks of our understanding of the social world. So schemas influence a wide range of things, including what we pay attention to. So there have been a lot of really interesting eye tracking studies finding that when you make salient, right, or prime something, it guides where people pay attention to a given stimulus. So there was this really funny study looking at the baby schema concept. And basically the baby schema concept is that there are these infantile traits that are very appealing to humans, right? So we see something that seems very babyish and it induces empathy and caretaking in us. So interestingly, this study tested whether priming uh, the baby schema and images of humans, dogs, and cats would affect the level of gaze duration. And what they found is that when humans, dogs, and cats looked a little bit more babyish, thereby activating the baby schema, they were gazed at longer and they were rated as being more cute. I think that's just a hilarious study and very interesting. Our schemas also influence the meaning we assign to information and experience, especially when it's ambiguous. And so when we're filling in the blanks, we rely on our schemas to inform us. Our schemas also influence how we interpret nonverbal behavior. This is super common, where you can look at someone and you sort of assume a lot of things based on their body behavior. If their arms are crossed, if their mouth is turned downward a little bit, or their eyebrows kind of scrunched, you immediately assume that they're negative, right? So this is kind of like a, sorry, I'm going to be a little profane for a second, but resting bitch face. A lot of people say that they have resting bitch face or RBF. Um, and it's really a struggle for them because what they find is that their face is activating these schemas in other people, right? It's making other people think that they're angry when really that's just their face. So there was a study you talked about in your book where participants watched an interview and were told that the interviewee was talking about sex or a different topic, and if they were told she was talking about sex, they rated her as being more anxious because they just presumed that she would be anxious talking about sex, which makes sense. So that's another way that our schemas influence how we interpret those around us. So how do schemas work? Um, First, schemas work through accessibility. So accessibility refers to the ease with which people can bring an idea into consciousness and use it in thinking. So if I was driving with a friend to a certain part of town and I said, this area of town isn't very great, right then I'm sort of making the idea of crime and danger accessible to my friend. And that in turn might put my friend sort of on the lookout for danger and even make them more likely to interpret an ambiguous situation as something that's dangerous. We also have the concept of salience. So salience is the aspect of a schema that is active in one's mind, and consciously or not, colors perception and behavior. So salience and accessibility are a little different here, and that accessibility really sounds a little bit more conscious and intentional. It's emphasizing this idea of someone bringing their own thought consciousness and using it actively and thinking, whereas salience might not be so conscious. It could refer to being primed with something and not even realizing it. Finally, we have the idea of associative networks. These are models for how pieces of information are linked together and stored in memory. And the thing about associative models is that bringing one concept to mind can theoretically prime others, even without consciousness, which is an interesting idea. The idea of associative networks is all over social psychology, and what you'll find is that a lot of research, especially in the 80s and 90s, was really focused on coming up with like these really cool and almost sexy ways of priming an associative network. Um, But something like I don't know if I've told this story before, but there was a study finding that a woman dropping a tampon led to people sitting further away from her, right? And so the idea there is that tampon activated some kind of associative network that maybe activated feelings of disgust or discomfort with the fact that women have menstrual cycles, leading then for the participants to distance themselves from her. Here is an example of an associative network. There's one about Star Wars in your book, and so that's kind of fun to look at. This one is about Tiger Woods, and a fun fact about this, as it states in the editor's note, is that the figure was submitted for publication prior to some interesting news coming about Tiger Woods that I think probably has really changed some people's perspective of him. Take a moment here and think back to whenever you watched the last lecture. And if anything, and week 2 kind of feels a bit related to this concept of an associative network for you. Really, the idea of an associative network, like I said, it's just displayed all over social psychology. But what I'm really specifically thinking about is the hierarchy of goals that we talked about, right? So the hierarchy of goals is there to explain to you how our concrete goals and actions feed into abstract goals. So how doing something like waking up at 7 a.m. every morning is actually related to your goal of being a successful human, and how your goal of being a successful human is ultimately related to you being your ideal self. The idea that our concrete actions can be associated with and then ultimately bring up more abstract ideals is very common in social psychology. Another thing to think about when it comes to associative networks is terror management theory. So terror management theory states, right, that we do so much in our life ultimately to avoid the idea of death, that we invest in self-esteem structures and our personal relationships, and we defend our cultural worldview because all of this brings us a sense of meaning, which in turn makes us feel like we will symbolically transcend death, right? And so when I lay it out like that, you realize that there are several associative steps that start with you posting a selfie on Instagram and somehow end at you transcending death in a symbolic sense. So in the future, when you are thinking about other social psychology research studies and research studies in other domains as well, think about how the associative network comes into play and the assumptions and associations that are being made there. Your book also covers the idea of chronically accessible schemas, and I want to talk about this as it sort of relates to memory encoding. So chronically accessible schemas are schemas that are easily brought to mind because they are personally important and used frequently. So when you think about it from a memory encoding perspective, what this means is that there was a repeated exposure, or that something in the exposure to something, whatever it is, a given stimuli, feels so significant, oftentimes so emotionally impactful, that it gets integrated into one's understanding of themselves and the world. So people tend to interpret things around them to be consistent with their chronically accessible schemas. So we have schemas that can be activated, right? And we do that through priming the salience of a given idea or topic. And then we have our chronically accessible schemas. And so it's like those things are sort of always on the mind. So I was just talking about terror management theory with you guys. And I think, as I mentioned in the last lecture, I study terror management theory. And I think about it a lot. And so one of my chronically accessible schemas is probably just to tell my friends that whatever they're doing they're doing because they just want to avoid their own death. So that's one example of chronically accessible schemas, and it's a really annoying one. Don't be that person to your friends. So chronically accessible schemas are often closely related with personality traits and factors such as attachment style and political ideals. So we talked about attachment style in our last lecture, I believe, and people with different attachment styles tend to approach situations and interpret information in ways that are consistent with how they actively believe attachment works. Another study found that experimental primes affected reactions to political ads, but most strongly when these primes are already consistent with existing schemas. So imagine that you're not a fan of Joe Biden, and then you're shown a political ad that paints Joe Biden in a pretty good light, right? Like it covers things that he objectively did that were objectively good. And you're like, okay, I guess this guy isn't complete garbage. You know, that prime, right, would have activated a schema of Joe Biden being okay, right, where that Democrats are acceptable sometimes. And then maybe you would rate him as a little bit more positive than you would have if you hadn't seen that prime. But you can imagine that if you hate Joe Biden and then you see an ad just talking about how Joe Biden sucks, that's probably going to push you in the other direction far more strongly because it's already consistent with how you feel. I have a lot of, vaguely clinical examples for you today. And I do this because we should be thinking about how social cognition is playing out, and not just people in general, but people who have psychological disorders, right? So we know that people with psychological disorders have variations and sometimes even disruptions or dysfunction in their social and cognitive abilities. And so understanding how social cognition is affected for them is really important for helping traumatized people. So as we talked about, chronically accessible schemas develop through repeated exposure to information consistent with that schema or through exposure in which the information was interpreted as highly important. Theories in PTSD propose that traumatic memories can be encoded into one's memory in such a way that they are easily and frequently triggered. And theoretically, this happens when the memories are really intense. So the main idea used to be that feeling really helpless or horrified during a traumatic experience would lead you to encode that memory in a way that it was sort of chronically accessible. But then it would be bringing up your trauma feelings all the time and eventually lead to PTSD. The current conceptualization of PTSD is a bit more broad now, and it doesn't require that you have felt helpless or horrified during the trauma, but nonetheless, it's still focused on this concept of chronically accessible schemas that are bringing up really difficult and problematic emotions and causing PTSD symptoms. Traumatic experiences contributing to chronically accessible schemas might explain social cognitive differentiations we see in traumatized people, which again contribute to their symptomology. So one thing that's been found is that traumatized individuals tend to overestimate the likelihood of risk in a given situation, right? So if you take people who have been traumatized and those who haven't been traumatized, you find that those with the trauma background are overestimating how risky a given situation is. You can see how that would play out in real life and how that could be impactful to their life's functioning. What was interesting was that in the study, they were asked to estimate the likelihood and increase of risk for negative situations, neutral situations, and positive situations. And so they found that traumatized people were estimating higher levels of risk in positive situations compared to non-traumatized people. And just imagine, right, the implications that could have for someone's life. And one interesting thing they found is that overestimating risk in a positive situation actually predicted PTSD symptoms. So you can see here how these social cognitive concepts we're talking about are also very relevant to people who are dealing with psychiatric disorders. So then the next question is, can priming change our thoughts and behaviors? And that should already be obvious based on what we've already talked about, that yes, it can. But there are sections in your book that cover this, and so I thought I would too. So one thing to know is that priming can guide our impressions of others. So one study found that participants primed with danger words versus positive words rated a hypothetical man who likes to take part in high-risk activities more negatively. Similarly, priming can change our behavior. So participants primed with politeness versus rudeness were less likely to interrupt a busy researcher. So what's interesting here is that at this point in the book, I remember seeing that it brought up um, that some studies looking at how primes change behavior have been heavily criticized, and some haven't been replicated. So I think we talked about replications in our first lecture. Replication is when you basically rerun a study to see if the results are the same. We're going to talk about replication more at the end of the lecture. But it's interesting to think here how maybe our primes aren't always consistent. And it actually makes sense that our primes aren't always consistent because I was just telling you guys how we all have at least a somewhat unique understanding and structure of the world, and therefore any given prime is going to affect at least some of us differently than others of us. The other thing that I thought would be fun to tell you guys is that there's been some research finding that sometimes there are researcher effects in priming. Um, we know this in that sometimes researchers will consciously or unconsciously try to manipulate the data they collect. That's one kind of researcher effect. But another researcher effect that has emerged is the attractiveness of researchers. So they've found that when someone shows up to the lab and the researcher is attractive, sometimes the participants will react differently than if the researcher is more average looking. And I just think that's really funny and wanted to share that with you. So far, we have talked about how people have been primed through being asked to write about different things, through being given feedback, through reading positive and or negative or reckless words. Um, so now we're going to touch on subliminal priming, which is basically exposure to stimuli below the threshold of perception. It's very likely that a lot of you have a schema about subliminal priming that has been imparted by media representations, right? I think most of us have seen a movie or a TV show where someone gets subliminally primed into doing something insane, like killing someone. Uh, and you should know that's probably not likely or going to happen. That's not really how subliminal priming works. So instead, subliminal priming leads to a given schema being more accessible. So you would already have the schema. Subliminal priming just might make it a little bit more salient to you. So you probably won't be killing anyone unless you already have plans to. That is a joke. So now we're going to talk about how subliminal priming has been used in terror management research. We talked about terror management theory last lecture. And it's really a theory you guys should know well because it's a broad theory of motivation and it's what I study, so I'm going to use it as an example quite a bit. And it's also what the authors of the book study, so they, I think, use it quite a bit too in the readings. So in terror management theory, we use a pretty standard manipulation where we ask people to write about what feelings come up for them when they think about death. This is known as a supraliminal prime, right? So participants are aware that they have seen this stimuli, even if they're not aware that we're specifically trying to prime the effects of death on worldview defense. However, some terror management research has used subliminal death primes where death-related words are exposed below the threshold of perception. And what we've found is that subliminal death primes, just like supraliminal death primes, increase worldview defense. What is cool about subliminal death primes is that they lead to immediate worldview defense, whereas supraliminal death primes only lead to worldview defense after a delay. And so there's a benefit to subliminal death primes because there's no conscious awareness of them. You see the effects more quickly. Another more recent terror management study found that subliminal death primes increase self-esteem striving via humor. So not just worldview defense, but you can see how just being exposed to death without realizing it makes you try to find comfort in your environment by presenting yourself as a really funny and amazing individual. I also wanted to touch on social priming and behaviors, etc. during the COVID-19 pandemic. And so hopefully you guys find this interesting rather than exhausting, but sorry if it's exhausting for you. So one recent study found that priming people to rely on their reasoning rather than to rely on their emotions increased intentions to wear face coverings in public during the pandemic. So this is one way that we can see that the way that information is framed leads people to change how they intend to behave. Although, of course, we don't have data on whether or not people did wear face coverings more often. Another study found that priming pro-social behavior versus priming behavior oriented towards oneself promoted more positive affect and feelings of meaningfulness during the pandemic. So this was a really interesting study that found that those who were given the opportunity to do something nice for someone else, hypothetically, felt more positively afterwards. And that's really significant, right? Because right now I think a lot of people are struggling to feel meaningfulness and positive affect when life is so difficult and there are so few opportunities to really connect with others. This third study is actually a study that I did recently, and I feel pretty dorky presenting my research to you guys. But in my defense, when I was trying to find research to tell you guys about the pandemic, there really was not that much. So in this study that we did in June, we collected a bunch of participants online and we asked them to think either about the social isolation aspect of the pandemic, the health threat of the pandemic, or a control topic, where we asked people to write about their favorite television show. We found that people who had high PTSD symptoms responded to thoughts of the pandemic with lower levels of coping self-efficacy. So coping self-efficacy basically refers to one's confidence in being able to cope with a given stressor. And those with high trauma symptoms, when reminded of the pandemic, reported less confidence in being able to just generally cope. And this is really important because, right, we're all being sort of encouraged to deal with the new normal and to maintain our normal lives as much as we can. We also found that those who were feeling really psychologically affected by the pandemic, so those who felt like anxiety and worry due to the pandemic were affecting their ability to socialize, to work, to do their daily tasks, also decreased reports of coping self-efficacy after reminders of the pandemic. So here's just another example, a really timely example of how priming people can change how they're feeling in the moment. And of course, what we would assume here is that in real life, if someone was reminded of the pandemic, they would feel like they couldn't cope so well. Okay, so we can go ahead and have another break. I think that was a really long chunk. Sorry, guys. And then, yeah, come back to the rest of the lecture whenever you're ready. Okay, welcome back to anyone who took a break. So far, this lecture has been quite interesting in that we started our lecture on social cognition quite broad and talked about a lot of research and big theories. And then we kind of got into the details talking about schemas and went back to a broader perspective. And now we're back in the details again to talk about dual process theories of cognition. I've talked to you guys about dual process theories of cognition before, so it should sound familiar. These dual process theories basically state, very simply, that there are two broad modes of processing in human cognition, and specifically in social cognition. We have processes that are automatic. They stem from the experiential system of thought. And the experiential system, as you guys might recall, is a system that's based on intuition and emotion. Our automatic processes um, tend to control our more basic automatic thoughts and behaviors. So for example, imagine if you had to always tell yourself to breathe, right? That would be so tedious, it would take up a lot of headspace. So within the dual process framework, one example of an automatic process is breathing. Another example of an automatic process is your startle response, right? So when someone scares you, that jump you do, orienting towards whatever noise or, whatever scared you, all of that is an automatic process. Those two processes are obviously evolved, but you can also learn automatic processes. An example of a learned automatic process is the example that I used a week or two ago whenever we last talked about this. So when you're driving in your car and someone cuts you off and you immediately slam on your brakes without even thinking about it, that's a learned automatic process. Obviously, we did not evolve to know where the brake pedal is in a car, and we definitely didn't evolve to know to hit the brake pedal when there's something in front of us. The interesting thing about dual process models is that in addition to automatic processes, there are controlled processes. Controlled processes stem from the cognitive system, and the cognitive system of thought is based in logic and rationale. These are processes that typically take a lot of thought, consideration, are based in your logic, morals, social ideas, etc. So again, in my last example, I said that it would be an automatic process or reaction to slam on your brakes when someone cuts you off in their car. It's a more controlled process to decide then that what they did was immoral and dangerous and that you should write down their license plate number to report them to the police. What's important to note here is that controlled processes can become automatic through repeated exposure and learning, right? So, like I kind of implied, when you first start driving, it kind of takes a moment to remember to slam on the brakes. And I bet a lot of us, including me, have had the experience of trying to use the brake and then you accidentally hit the gas instead, or vice versa. So driving is one example of something that starts out controlled and eventually fades into this automatic process. And there's obviously a lot of benefit to that, right? When we learn these things and they become automatic, it gives us a lot more energy and headspace to do what's most important, which is keep ourselves alive and free of danger. Automatic processes really work on basic stimuli. So they are those automatic reactions that are responding to any given thing in the environment. Our controlled processes and the cognitive system that they stem from elaborate on the information around us. So in a dual process model, we have these controlled processes that really allow us to take in a lot more information about the world and inform our understanding of the world. Our automatic processes keep us safe, but so do our controlled processes. Along these lines, we have heuristics, which are mental shortcuts used for making judgments or decisions. So again, slamming on your brakes, that's a heuristic. Stemming from dual process models, we have the idea of explicit attitudes and implicit attitudes. We're going to spend a few slides on implicit attitudes, but first we'll talk about explicit attitudes. These are evaluations that are consciously made using the cognitive system, right? So they are a controlled process. Explicit attitudes in social psychology are often measured through self-report measures. So this typically means asking someone to have some level of introspection to their experience and accurately reporting it. But as you might recall from chapter 1 and lecture 1, we find that introspection is quite limited, especially when it comes to snap decision making. So what I have here are a couple examples of times when we really question our self-report measures. Imagine trying to ask someone scientifically, do you feel good about yourself? One, that's just a bad question, right? Like how good you feel about yourself is often dependent on the context that you're in, right? You might not feel like a good person, but maybe you feel like a good student, or vice versa. Regardless, if you ask someone if they feel good about themselves, it kind of puts them on the defense, and they might say they do, even if a lot of times they don't. Another example is, do you ever lie, right? This is a time when someone might feel like they want to lie about how much they lie because lying is not very socially desirable. Social desirability is the tendency to represent oneself in a way that is socially acceptable to the point that it's likely untrue. We sometimes measure social desirability in research projects to see if people are really going to accurately represent themselves. So imagine someone who scores high in social desirability, and then you measure their political attitudes later on in the survey. You might question whether or not they're giving you really accurate information because we know that our political opinions tend to be pretty touchy. Nonetheless, understanding and measuring explicit attitudes are important because think about when you're navigating the world and talking with other people. They're usually giving you their explicit opinion on something, right? When you're working with someone, what their implicit feelings are, which we'll talk about in a moment, don't really matter. It's about what they say to you. So even though there are some limitations to the measurement of explicit attitudes, still very important to investigate and understand within social psychology and other fields of psychology. Then we have implicit attitudes and associations. So the flip side of explicit attitudes are implicit attitudes, which are automatic associations that make up the experiential system. So as I already talked about, some of them are genetic, right, that we evolved to sort of just have them ingrained within ourselves, but most are learned. Implicit attitudes are measured implicitly. I know that sounds a little redundant, but I actually really want you guys to understand that we talk about implicit attitudes and explicit attitudes, and then we measure things implicitly and explicitly, right? So there is the concept we have, right? The abstract concept of an explicit or an implicit attitude, and then there's how we operationalize it through measuring it explicitly or implicitly. So as I said, the explicit attitude measure is a self-report measure. Implicit attitudes are measured in ways that the participant doesn't know what's being measured. Because if you told someone you were interested in their attitudes, then that would likely tap into their explicit measures and not their explicit attitudes, excuse me, and not their implicit attitudes. So what we often try to do is see how people respond to stimuli without them knowing that we're interested in different associations or attitudes they might have. By far, the most popular implicit measure is the implicit association test. What the implicit association test does is presents you with two words and based on your reaction time, indicates to what extent the association of these two words are associated with you. associated for you. So, for example, one measure of implicit self-esteem would be to put people in front of an IAT, an implicit association test, and show them two words, me and good, right? And then you would show them two words, me and bad. And whichever one they reacted to faster suggests that that association is more accessible to them and reflects, right, their sort of automatic beliefs that they have. So if I react to me and good better than I react faster than I react to me and bad, that implies that I have positive implicit self-esteem. The implicit association test has been very significant to studying prejudice and racial bias in social psychology. It's become quite controversial as this term has really entered our cultural world. Um, there's a difference between having implicit associations and being overtly racist. And there's potentially a difference between having implicit associations and being subtly racist. This test simply measures associations based on the idea that reaction time reflects the extent that an association is accessible. Nothing about that definition that I just said implies objective racism. And so it's important for you guys to all know that and to tell anyone who's potentially confused by it. Because what we found is that since racism has become such a salient topic in the news due to the shooting of unarmed Black people, implicit bias has come up, and it's come up in ways that don't necessarily make sense and that I think make people feel bad about themselves. And so it's important to know that you shouldn't feel bad if you have implicit associations, right? It's sort of something you might not know about and doesn't necessarily imply anything for your behavior. That said, some research has shown that implicit associations are associated with explicit attitudes. So a recent study found that implicit prejudice is negatively associated with positive views towards multiculturalism. So the more prejudice that people showed on an implicit association test, the less they felt that multiculturalism was cool. Though implicit associations have been very popular and significant to the understanding of prejudice and racial bias, they're common in all areas of prejudice and bias, and also beyond that. As we'll talk more about later, there's a lot we understand about the world based on our implicit associations, and there's a lot we understand about ourselves and other people, right? So it not only affects, right, this broad concept of prejudice towards other groups of people, but it affects our interpersonal interactions, it affects our self-esteem, and all of that affects how we function in the world. So theoretically, this concept is a pretty big deal. Okay, so with that in mind, what I want you guys to do next is go to the Project Implicit website and take a test. So here you'll be able to take an implicit association test and really see what it's like. This is going to be great for your training as a psychology student to have this understanding of an abstract concept and then to see specifically how it's measured. So you might have an interesting reaction to it to see how we talk about this broad thing called implicit associations and then see the simplicity of the measure itself. Along those lines, take a moment to watch this TED Talk with Nazarene Banaji. She's one of the original authors of the implicit association test. It's a TED Talk, so you know it's great. She does a lot of talks on implicit bias, and so I think it would be really good for you guys to watch. Also, she's wearing a very dope jacket. Note that there will be probably at least one exam question on this video, and the lecture's at 2 hours today, so you guys have the time to watch it. So, like I said, I do research on implicit and explicit attitudes and their correspondence. So I just wanted to cover this, right? So we feasibly have these two systems that can sometimes have quite different reactions to external stimuli. And sometimes one system overrides the other. Sometimes these two systems are in tandem with one another. And other times they don't correspond very well. So the correspondence or matching of implicit and explicit attitudes depends on the topic. So our political preferences tend to correspond pretty well on an implicit, explicit level, but what we value in life less so, right? Because we all say that we value our careers and we want to get married one day and have a dog and 2 kids, because we're supposed to feel that way. But our implicit values don't always necessarily match up to that. So sometimes our implicit attitudes predict the later development of our later explicit attitudes. Our implicit attitudes also emerge when we're sort of feeling like we're under cognitive load. So when executive control is limited, right? So this is executive control refers to a cognitive ability to really take in and manipulate information and to make decisions. When our executive control is limited for whatever reason, it was found that implicit partner evaluations are more greatly associated with forgiveness towards partners. So sometimes our implicit evaluations emerge really as the strongest predictor of something very significant in our lives, like how we react to our relationships. Like I said, sometimes there are discrepancies in implicit and explicit attitudes, and these things often lead to poor mental health. So, for example, congruence between implicit and explicit motives is associated with emotional well-being. So this is sort of related to the values I was talking about earlier. When someone explicitly says that they are motivated for their career, for love, for themselves, and that's true also on an implicit level, they tend to be happier and more well-adjusted. Another study found that meditation actually improves the congruence of implicit and explicitly measured self-esteem. This, of course, presumably contributes then to better mental health. Anyone who's interested in mental health or has ever gone to therapy knows how well celebrated mindfulness and meditation are for mental health purposes. And the idea there is that it sort of makes you at one with yourself, right? It reduces any of those discrepancies you're experiencing and helps you move on with your life. So that research is consistent with that. So I think what's interesting is that um, it's very easy to take away from dual process models and the research associated with them that our experiential automatic system is flawed in some way, right? That we have these automatic reactions and usually we're changing them a little bit or they're quite negative or housed in biases. Um, and that's true. Sometimes our automatic reactions are problematic. But the unconscious is actually incredibly beneficial, and I really wanted to emphasize that for you guys. Many of our automatic processes are functional and helpful. They evolved and developed for a reason, and that was primarily to benefit us, right? So just like we have an automatic reaction to a snake, our automatic reaction to a car cutting us off or to an angry face is there to protect us. Your book covers 5 different ways that the unconscious is smart. I'm just going to cover 2 of them. First is intuition. So your book talks about how our intuitive beliefs actually help us quite a bit. So one, we have an intuitive understanding of language and the logic behind language. Another research project found that intuitively approaching a task led to higher detections of deception in that task. So in this research, people are often asked to do something intuitively or deliberatively, right? To sort of just follow their automatic processes or to really step back and think about it. And so when people are being intuitive versus deliberative, they're actually better at noticing that they're being deceived, which is really interesting. Another study found that promoting intuition actually leads women, but not men, to be more altruistic during a dictator game. So this is just like a lab uh, game that involves power over people. And so here we can kind of see how demographics interact with a priming situation, right? Where priming intuition for men didn't necessarily lead to more altruism, but it does for women. Presumably, women are sort of taught to be kind to people. Men are also taught to be kind, but I think gender stereotypes present women as more nice rather than forceful. And so encouraging women to be more intuitive might lead them to rely on those more stereotypical features of themselves, whereas telling men to be more intuitive might lead them to rely on more stereotypical features of themselves too, and we tend to see men as more forceful and powerful. Another aspect of how smart the unconscious is that um, our understanding of the world and the information we take in is ultimately based in our physiology, right? And we often aren't paying attention to what our physiology is doing, or we're only somewhat aware of it. But even though we're not consciously aware of our physiological processes, that doesn't mean they're not informing how we approach different situations. And that's basically consistent with the somatic marker hypothesis, which is also discussed in your book. This is the idea that changes in the body are experienced as emotion and guide decision making. So this can refer to your heartbeat, your breathing, like how fast or how slowly you're breathing, but even the level of exhaustion that you feel. It's even possible that hormones are affecting your behavior. There's a lot of research on the presence of cortisol, for example, and how that's associated with psychological functioning. So really a lot of our behavior and our social behavior is associated with our physiological processes. And that's where interoceptive awareness comes in. So interoceptive awareness is basically body awareness. It's awareness of internal bodily sensations, as well as their associations with other external and internal stimuli. There is a ton of research in this area that's very interesting. So people who are higher in interoceptive awareness are better at decision-making tasks. Interoceptive awareness also facilitates emotional reappraisal. So for anyone who's interested in emotion regulation, which is sort of in clinical psychology and sort of in social psychology, emotional reappraisal basically means as you're experiencing an emotion, reappraising the situation to change your emotional reaction to it. So in that sense, it makes sense that interoceptive awareness facilitates emotional reappraisal because you need to have an awareness of that emotion as it's coming on to be able to change it. Additionally, interoceptive awareness is associated with successfully evaluating facial expression. So this really speaks to the role of empathy in our social processing. Not only does empathy help us maintain social bonds, but our empathy is there to help us understand how others are reacting, and to give us really a felt sense of that so we can respond to that. So interestingly, people who are better at understanding their bodily sensations are also better at understanding what's going on for others. So I wanted to go back to social priming and the replication crisis. So I just referenced this a little bit ago in this lecture, that some important priming studies, right, these studies that have primed some kind of feeling and noticed how it changed behavior, are failing to replicate, right? So when people try to run these studies again, they're not finding the same results. So this is consistent with a crisis that started in psychology over a decade ago. It's called the replication crisis, and it came out of a lot of different things happening, but one major thing was that core findings that people assumed to be foundational to the understanding of human behavior failed to replicate. And this was really concerning for people. Uh, One reason this might be happening is due to statistical and methodological issues. So psychology is a relatively young field, and our understanding of what appropriate statistics are and what strong methodology is as we try to understand abstract human behavior has changed over the years. And so some people in studying the replication crisis have suggested that it's due to changes in statistics and methodology that we are failing to replicate. There's also been a movement to identifying questionable research practices. I want you guys to know what questionable research practices are. Questionable research practices are these things that aren't inherently unethical, right? They're not fabricating data, for example, but they potentially represent research in a way that is problematic and potentially misleading and may lead to these replication failures. So one questionable research practice is the selective reporting of data. So sometimes people will collect a data set full of data and then only report what's statistically significant or interesting. Another questionable research practice is optional stopping. So optional stopping refers to basically collecting enough data until your research project is statistically significant. Recall back to lecture 1 where we talked about p-values and statistical significance. So we want our effects to be statistically significant, but the interesting thing about p-values is that p-values are greatly influenced by your sample size. So the larger the sample size you have, the more likely you are to have a significant p-value, even if the effect size isn't that large. So what we found is that some people in the past were just sort of collecting enough data until they got that p-value they wanted, and then they would stop. And doing this practice can potentially lead to a false positive finding. Another questionable research practice is the file drawer problem. And so the file drawer problem refers to non-significant findings never being published, right? So there has been this bias in most of science for people to only publish things that are interesting or new. If you fail to find an effect, it was sort of assumed that your methodology was bad or that there was nothing there and no one needed to talk about it. But the problem with the file drawer problem is that when everyone is putting their failed studies in a file drawer, other people don't know about them and either assume that thing hasn't been studied yet or that it's only been studied successfully. So if I wanted to study how priming people with thoughts of pizza impact their exercise goals, and all I know is that 400 studies have shown that priming people with pizza makes them exercise less, and then I replicate that and I don't find an effect, that's going to be really confusing for me. But what I wouldn't know is that there are actually thousands of studies failing to find that priming pizza affects exercise goals that are all in the file drawer. Another questionable research practice I want you guys to know about is the post hoc storytelling problem. So this happens when people set out to study something and they don't find an effect, and so they say it's something else. So one problem with this is that our research needs to be theoretically derived, and when you're doing post hoc storytelling, it's not theoretical. You're kind of just making up a story after the fact. And that increases the likelihood that it's not going to replicate again in the future. All of these questionable research practices have theoretically contributed to the failed replications that your book talks about, and some of the things I've mentioned here. It's important to consider these things as you potentially go into research experience and maybe even research careers. And I really want you to just know about the concept of questionable research practices, and in particular know about the file drawer problem. To give you a more specific example, there was a 1996 study that found that participants who were subtly exposed to the concept of age walked more slowly when leaving the lab, right? So this is kind of what I was referencing earlier when I was saying that a lot of social psychology studies rely on this idea of the associative network and more concrete or abstract concepts within the associative network. And so the idea here was that just being exposed to the concept of age would lead to the activation of age-related stereotypes, which include walking slower. And then that for some reason participants would emulate that. That's the part I find confusing here. So 2012 replication of this study failed to find an effect. So they did not replicate it. They also went on to test whether or not this effect was due to experimenter bias. So it's well known that researchers or experimenters who know the hypotheses of the study might consciously or unconsciously influence the study. And that's what they found here, was that experimenters, when they believed that priming the participant with age would lead to them walking slowly, actually led to the effect being found. Whereas when experimenters were told that the opposite would happen, right, that being primed with age would lead them to walk faster, there was no effect found. So then this suggests that the experimenters who were collecting data on this study inadvertently contributed to the results that were found. And this is often why people like to do double-blind research projects. So this is when the participant doesn't know what condition they're in, and when the researchers don't know either. So when I was in college, I was running terror management research studies, and I would never know if that participant was primed with death or control topic until after they left the laboratory. Because if I had known, it's possible that I would have tried to influence them in some way to be in line with the hypotheses that we had for that study. So this is a little bit of an existential crisis that I've dumped on you, I think, to talk about how we have all these research that book covers, and then finding that these ideas aren't as concrete or stable as we thought. So clearly what that means is we should just throw out the whole science and never do anything ever again, right? As a very dry joke on my part. No, so what it means is that we need to be active scientists and researchers as we read this research and really think about what's going on. And so you might realize that what I'm doing is a callback to lecture 1 when I talked about the different things that you should consider when analyzing a given research project. So hopefully this slide looks familiar then. So when it comes to evaluating research, you want to think about what the theory says, how it organizes and explains data. You want to think about how the data is collected and quantified. So let's think about that study we just talked about. I didn't give you details on how the data was collected or quantified, but you can kind of start to think about how mistakes could be made in that situation, right? So the dependent variable was a participant walking out of the laboratory. So presumably that means the researcher has to pull out a stopwatch and time them, right? Imagine the errors that can happen with pulling out a stopwatch and timing someone walking out of a laboratory. When do you know when to start? By the point they grab their backpack, earlier than that, when they say goodbye, right? These are things that you would want to think about when analyzing this research project. The other thing you'd want to think about are the methods and what the study design is, right? So one of the things we've already touched on is that the experimenters were not blind to the condition that participants were in, right? They knew whether or not they were being primed with age or not. And the experimenters knew what the hypotheses were, and so they knew that people primed with age were supposed to walk slower. And so even if they weren't actively trying to change the results of the study, that could lead to them unconsciously letting the stopwatch run a couple seconds longer than it's supposed to. And then finally, what statistical analyses are used? So this is related to the questionable research practice I brought up of the stopping rule, right? So when you are relying on a p-value to tell you that your research is important, you need to realize then that your sample size and how you're collecting your sample is relevant to that. So if you are trying to just collect a sample until you get a certain p-value, that might be problematic. And when evaluating research, you want to consider whether or not they potentially did that, because occasionally they will admit that, especially in earlier social psychology research papers. They would say, oh, we had a p-value of 0.08, so we collected a bit more to see if it would be statistically significant. That is something that is not considered to be okay anymore. So I've covered this evaluating research page a couple of times now, so you should really take away that it's very important for you guys. So I'm bringing up these issues in science and replication not because I want you guys to feel negatively about social psychology. Not at all. Rather, I want you to understand the importance of replication and of theory. Any given study does not say much about the phenomenon of social behavior. But similarly, one failed replication says just as much as one positive study. Right? So when we only have one study that represents an entire idea, you basically have nothing. Direct and conceptual replications help us know if our studies were just random little accidents or if they actually reflect a general human tendency. The fact that that study we just talked about wasn't replicated for 20 years is a little insane, right? The idea that people are walking more slowly when primed with age should be accepted based on one study just does not seem appropriate to me whatsoever. Our studies, especially our more fantastical ones, need to be replicated. They need to be replicated directly, which means everything about the original study is done over again, and they need to be replicated conceptually. And so this means that the original study isn't done in the exact way, but something that gets at the same concepts is. So in terror management theory, we think that people engage in self-esteem striving after reminders of death. And so if you remind someone of death and you find that they are trying harder to be a funny person, that's one example of self-esteem striving. A conceptual replication, arguably, would be reminding someone of death and seeing them rate themselves as more funny, right? So that's the same concept, but two different ways of measuring it. Conceptual replications help us feel more confident that we are measuring what we want to measure and that we are seeing the associations that we're aiming to observe. This research also lends credence to how important our theories are in social psychology and how theory really drives research, right? So you can't do post hoc storytelling when you have a theory that's driving your ideas. Our theories then create stronger foundations for understanding and accepting the strengths of a given base. Theories help you replicate or fail to replicate an effect, and it's all consistent within this idea that has already existed prior to your research project. So it's important when you're doing research to try to do something that is theoretically derived, because then you already have good reasoning for why you're doing what you're doing, and you're not just randomly testing something until something becomes statistically significant. Okay, that is the end of the lecture. I rushed through the last few slides because I'm running late to an appointment, so sorry about that, you guys. This is about 2 hours long, and then you guys have like maybe 30 minutes of videos to watch throughout the lecture, so I think it came to a good time. Reminders that quizzes are due this Sunday. You need Launchpad for them. If you have issues, email me. And like I said last time, we have an exam coming up in 2 weeks. Yeah, 2 weeks from tomorrow, which is Thursday. So get ready for that, you guys. Email me if you have any questions. Please look at all those videos that I linked. And yeah, I will, virtually see you guys when I see you. Okay, bye.